Our next speaker today is Dr. Joanna Huckster, and she'll be presenting Communicating Beyond the Choir. And Dr. Huckster is an assistant professor of environmental studies at Eckerd College. She teaches classes, public seminars, and workshops on climate change, communication, and environmental communication. Joanna has earned her both bachelor's degree and doctoral degree from the University of Delaware. She concentrated in environmental studies and geography, and her PhD in marine studies, and was directed towards environmental policy and climate change communication. Her doctoral dissertation focused on undergraduate student understanding of climate change and the misconceptions students have about this issue. How exciting. Please give a warm welcome to Dr. Joanna Huckster. So click this right there. Okay. Get the screen here.
Hello. Can you hear me? I can barely hear me, but that's okay. My name is Joanna Huckster, and I am a professor of environmental studies, assistant professor at Eckerd College. Like John said, I study public understanding of climate change. And the main reason why I do that is to help inform better climate change communication. So that's what I want to talk about today. And specifically, I want to talk about how to communicate beyond the choir, how to talk to people who may not already agree with you about climate change, which can be really difficult. And those of us who've tried to talk about climate change before have found out, yeah, it can be hard. And it's not just hard with people who deny climate change. It can even be hard with people who don't deny climate change. So, for instance, in my classes, I sometimes have trouble walking that fine line between making my students care and making them cry. And I'm trying not to make them cry, because that's too far. So, for a lot of us, because of that fine line and how difficult it can be, climate change ends up being sort of the massive, hot elephant in the room that we're all kind of thinking about, but maybe we aren't actually talking about. So we want to figure out how to move past that. And before I start telling you the best ways to do that, I want to also tell you about some people who are doing it really well. So the first person that I'm going to talk about is a woman named Katharine Hayhoe. Dr. Hayhoe is a climate scientist, and she's also an evangelical Christian. And she has an extensive body of work on communicating about climate change. If you go to her website, she has materials that you can use to help you communicate. She has short videos that you can watch. And she's a really, really good communicator because she bridges the gap between two different communities of people. She bridges the gap between scientists and also people who are not scientists, and maybe people who wouldn't necessarily be inclined to believe in the types of things that she knows through her science. Another really good resource for people who want to communicate about climate change is the Yale Program on Climate Change Communication. The Yale program includes psychologists and social scientists at George Mason University and, of course, Yale. And they're working together to study the best ways to communicate about climate change. And they have actually on their website many guides that you can use to help you your own communication. There's their little logo. And I will give you more information on how to find these people. But there are already people out there who are doing this really well. So one of the things that we've often found, though, as climate change communicators is that some people just aren't really that concerned. Even if they know that it's happening, they're not really that concerned about it. And this can be frustrating. And it turns out that if you look at a list of things that Americans are most concerned about, the things they say they worry about the most, climate change is down there. Up here we have the economy, social security system, crime and violence, all the way down. Environment is right here, and there's climate change below the environment. So this is a problem. How do we fix it? Well, to change this, we have to understand first why. Why is it this way? What is it that people understand about climate change? Why do we have denial about climate change, and why has it become so political? Because once we understand these things, we can do a better job of talking about it. So let's talk about public understanding of climate change first. What really matters in terms of public understanding of climate change? Well, the first thing would be the science, right? Climate change is a scientific issue. So what do people understand about the science? It turns out that people frequently confuse climate change with the hole in the ozone layer and other environmental issues. And even though that confusion has been going on since the early 90s, it still persists today. My undergraduate students still confuse climate change with the hole in the ozone layer. And they'll still tell me that they shouldn't use aerosol cans because of climate change, which aerosol cans in the US, they banned CFCs in the 70s, and that was for ozone. Even though CFCs are greenhouse gases, they're not much comparatively. People also frequently confuse weather and climate. And I actually have a metaphor that I like to use to talk to people about the difference between weather and climate. When somebody says, you know, it's snowing today, or we're having record colds, and so what's global warming, like a recent tweet you may or may not have seen. I like to say climate is how you decide where it is that you're going to go on vacation. Weather is how you decide what to pack. Climate is what makes you decide where you're going to go, but then you check the weather and see if it's going to rain before you pack. So climate is long-term trends about a particular area or maybe even the globe, and weather is much more short-term and localized. People confuse these things. Another thing that people have trouble with sometimes when talking about climate science is the scientific consensus. People tend to underestimate the scientific consensus on climate change. Exactly how much? Well, many recent reports have shown things like 97% of climate scientists agree that climate change is anthropogenic, but the public usually perceives it around 45 or 50% of climate scientists believing that climate change is anthropogenic. That's a really big gap. Part of that is driven by media and politics, but this is there, and this is something that we can work on. Another issue in climate change science that people have trouble understanding is the urgency and the consequences. People tend to think that climate change is going to happen far away, far in the future, and maybe not to us, or at least not to them. And because of that, I very much dislike the polar bear as a symbol for climate change. They're cute, I understand, but they aren't humans and they're far away. And some people are also afraid of them, so probably for good reason. So polar bears, although they're really cute, are not a great climate change communication symbol. We'll talk about better ones. And then finally, another thing that people need to understand is the actions they can take, obviously. And one wonderful thing about what's happening at this workshop is we're talking about all of those actions. So that is great. But often, people fall on two ends of the spectrum here. They either feel like the problem is so big that they cannot possibly solve it, and they aren't effective, and they can't do anything. Or they feel like, I recycled today, I did my part. And that's called single action bias, that feeling that you've done your one thing, you're doing everything you can, the end. So falling on both ends of that spectrum is something that we also need to work on. And we can. So the next thing to ask is there still denial about climate change? And most of you in this room probably know the answer to that. It's true, though, that an increasing number of Americans do believe that climate change is happening. So that's really good. And an increasing number of Americans are starting to believe that it's caused by human activity, although the total number that believe it's caused by human activity is lower. So what you can see by this map, this is from the Yale Project on Climate Change Communication, and you can see on this map a rating for each one of the states. And it's hard to see the numbers, but yellow is 50%. So this is the percentage of people in each of these states who think that global warming is caused mostly by human activities. So if it's getting blue, that would be they believe less or fewer people believe. If it's getting red, more people believe. This is 2014. This is 2016. So it's getting better, okay? The number of people who believe that global warming is caused mostly by human activities. But we still have a ways to go, right? The whole country, though, is at around 52%, which is actually also what Florida is, coincidentally. All right, so why? Why is there still denial? Well, it turns out that psychologically, climate change is actually the perfect storm for denial. Because we tend to think short term, like, how am I going to make it to the end of today? We tend to assess catastrophes as much riskier than long-term problems, even if the catastrophe itself is actually rare, less likely to happen. So for instance, people are considerably more likely to be afraid of flying in airplanes than they are of driving in cars. But you're statistically much more likely to get into a car crash, even if you're a frequent flyer. But that catastrophe, the airplane in the air falling out of the sky and crashing to the ground, seems much scarier than that day-to-day thing you do in your car over which you feel like you have some agency. And so, unless you're having those catastrophes happen, which they're happening more frequently, but they aren't constant, climate change is sort of background noise, and it's hard for people to get concerned about. We also tend to be very tribal. We are social, and we value our conformity to our tribe relatively highly. And this, of course, can come into play when we talk about things like our ideology, when we talk about religion, when we talk about our families or our other social groups. We value our connections to those people very highly. And I don't know if you've noticed this, humans are resistant to change. Mind blown, right? We aren't great at it. And the problem here with climate change is that it's going to take massive changes. And we all know that. It's not changes we can't do. We have the capability, but they can be really scary to people. And so all of those things put together mean that climate change ticks all of the boxes for denial. It makes some rational sense even why some people deny climate change. Now, when I'm talking about denial, I'm not just talking about active denial. I'm also talking about something called passive denial. Yeah, everybody read yeah. I have that on my door. Okay, so there's active denial, and then there's passive denial. Active denial is what you probably think of when you think of somebody who's denying climate change. It's when you are adamantly opposed to doing anything about it because you don't think it's real or you don't think it's caused by humans. That's active denial. Passive denial, I would actually argue, is a little bit more insidious. Passive denial is a large group of people, and sometimes probably each of us, who know that it's there, are concerned about it, but are still going about every part of their daily lives as if it's not happening. When I fly on an airplane, I am in passive denial. I tell myself that it's okay, that I'm doing it for this reason, I'm going to a climate conference, but there's just a little bit of denial happening in the background that this isn't a problem. And we all do it, and that's all right, because we can't guilt ourselves too much, but that passive denial can be the one that's harder to push past with a lot of people. We have a tendency, or we are able to employ some psychological tools to make it easier to preserve the beliefs that we already have. And one of these is called confirmation bias. Confirmation bias is seeking out information that confirms what we already believe. So for example, let's say you are having an argument with somebody and about a fact that you think is a fact. And so you Google it. You Google that fact, because that's how we solve all arguments now. And the first two hits that come up don't agree with you, but the third one does. Which one do you click? Yeah, unless you're a better person than I am, you click the third one. And so that exactly is confirmation bias, seeking out the information that confirms what you already believe. And then, like I said, we have the problem of tribalism, which is sticking to the beliefs of our tribe, our family, our religion, our ideology, in order to not be ostracized from them. And some studies have actually shown that we value loyalty to our tribe over the absolute truth. So this can be a bit of an issue when you're talking about something that's become politicized. And climate change has absolutely become politicized, as all of you know. So I don't need to get into the details of exactly why it's become politicized. I can if you want to talk to me, and it takes me at least 15 more minutes, so we won't do that. But it has, and if you actually look at trends back into the 90s, it's not. In the early 90s, there was no political divide. But over time, this has started to widen. We call this the wedge graph. This is the Democratic line. One of these is Democrats, one of them is liberals, and the other, this is Republicans and conservatives. And you can see that it's actually widening over time. And this is concern, climate change threat perception, basically. That concern has been, that gap between the concern is widening over time. All right, so we've got all of this background on why there's denial and the fact that there is, which we all kind of knew. So the next question is, do we talk about climate change? Besides the people in this room, who I'm sure does everybody else, or do you talk about it outside of circles like this? All right, so I said that more people are starting to believe that climate change is actually happening, and this is that graph. This graph shows you the percentage of adults who think that global warming was happening in 2016. The 2018 graphs aren't out yet, but I'm working on it. This was the graph that I showed you earlier. So this is the number of people who believe that global warming is caused mostly by human activity. Now I'm going to show you how many people say they talk about climate change at least occasionally. 33% of people say they only talk about climate change occasionally. 31% of people say they never talk about climate change. We have this number who think it's happening, but these people don't talk about it. So this is something we need to overcome. So how? Who should we be talking to? How do we make people care? And what are the most important things to communicate to those people? Well, that graph would have you believe that there are only two groups of people in the United States, people who believe and people who don't believe. But that's actually not true. There's actually a spectrum of beliefs on climate change in the US. And we actually have a tendency to overestimate the number of people who are going to adamantly disagree with us. So that Yale program, they did a 6 Americas study. And they found, or they did a study looking at public opinion and belief, and they found that there are 6 Americas. And this is what they look like. This is the alarmed, the concerned, the cautious, the disengaged, the doubtful, and the dismissive. So you range from people who are very, very concerned about climate change and doing something about it, probably most of the people in this room, to the people who are actually actively engaged on the other side, fighting to get people to not believe in climate change. But it turns out that's only 10% of the population in the US. That's not that many. If you add in the people who are doubtful, who don't think it's happening or definitely think it's not caused by us, that's 11%. But then you have the whole rest of this spectrum who would be easy people to talk to about climate change. And this group, the disengaged, are actually the most likely to say that they would be willing to change their mind. So you add all those people together, you have almost 80% of the population. 8 out of 10 people you're walking by on any given day would be good people to have a great, productive conversation with about climate change. And that's something that we all need to keep in mind to keep ourselves from being afraid to start these conversations. All right, so let's get ready to talk about climate change. What I want you to do is think of a person who you want to, or are maybe afraid to, talk to about climate change. Think of that person, maybe write them down if you want. Remember that you can talk to anyone, but your strategies for each of those people will be different. And then I want you to set a goal for yourself. What are you trying to achieve from this conversation? And it's important to set a goal, not just to help the conversation go smoothly, but also to help you. Because knowing what your goal is, maybe your goal isn't actually to convert that person or to get them to believe 100% in something that they 100% didn't believe before. Maybe your goal is just to start the conversation. Maybe your goal is just for you to feel heard and for them to feel heard. That is a much more achievable sounding goal. It makes it easier for you to start, it helps you to stay focused, and it helps you remember that you don't have to win every time. You can just start. All right, so you've set your goal. Let's talk about what you can't do, and then we'll talk about what you can. What doesn't work? Complicated scientific information, statistics, jargon, numbers. Probably some of you have tried this technique before, where you just rattle off all the numbers, and rattle off all the science, and it goes absolutely nowhere. For some people, it might work, but that's actually a relatively small portion of the population. I actually converted my husband into a climate change believer with the numbers. It doesn't work for anyone else. He's an engineer. So complicated jargon, that kind of thing will not be particularly helpful with most people. Counterintuitively, maybe, very, very sad and emotional pleas are not the best way to get people to deal with climate change. And the reason is we all have this finite pool of worry. And every day, we are going about our lives trying to get food on the table and making sure that Johnny is ready for practice and brought all of his homework to school, and that we aren't late to get him to the bus stop, and we aren't late for work, and we have a big presentation at work today, and suddenly, by the time you get home, your finite pool of worry is like this big. And someone is coming at you with this bucket of climate change information, and you're like, nope, my pool is this big. I have nothing. And so the more emotional your plea is, the more likely it is to push someone over the top and say, you know what, I can't. I just can't right now, because I'm emotionally numbed to this. It's sort of like how every time you see that Sarah McLachlan commercial for the animal rescue, you turn it off, or you flip to another channel. It's not because you don't care, it's just because you can't care right now. That's your finite pool of worry kicking in. Related to that is apocalyptic pleas, telling people it's the end of the world. That usually either taps into the finite pool of worry or makes them think you're crazy, even if you feel like it's actually the end of the world. Talking about things that are happening far away and far into the future, that, at least to start, really doesn't work. That's again why I don't like that polar bear. People need to know about things that are happening now or will be happening soon and will be happening close by. And then finally, this might seem pretty intuitive, but yelling, getting angry and fighting, which can be easy to do, doesn't work. When was the last time you had a screaming argument with somebody and then you walked away and said, you know what, they had some really good points. I think I'm gonna change my mind. It doesn't happen. So anytime that you start yelling or getting angry or the other person starts getting angry, you're both gonna become more entrenched in your views. So that's when it's time to walk away and know when to exit gracefully. All right, these are all the things that don't work. Let's talk about what does work. All right, I have my 4 simple steps. Know your audience, get their attention, address their understanding, some of the time, we'll talk about that, and empower them to act. Pretty easy steps. So what are these about? Know your audience helps you with the second step, which is get your attention. So what is important to that person? What's most important to them in life? This is all obviously easier if you know the person well, who you're going to talk to. It doesn't work so well if you're having a spontaneous conversation with your Uber driver, and I won't tell you how many times that's happened to me, but it happens a lot. If you can, it's good to know which America they are. Remember those 6 Americas. Where are they on that spectrum? How concerned are they about climate change already? And then, what do they know? And you can sort of suss out where their understanding is on climate change with a few conversations or a few early questions, but you may already have an idea if this is someone you know pretty well. All of this know your audience helps you with the second part, which is getting their attention. So one of the things that social scientists have been working on is something called message framing. So framing is finding an angle that resonates with the person you're talking to. What things are important to them and how can you connect them to climate change? So the first thing you can do, especially if you don't really know the person, like my Uber driver, is I can set the issue close to home or close to their home. I can set it to now, or I can set it to near term. So talking about things that are happening in Florida is relatively easy. When I used to give this talk in central Pennsylvania, it was a little more difficult because the water wasn't coming. But I could talk about, for instance, agriculture. So setting it close to home. Focusing on something that is resonant for that person or that person's group or subgroups or affiliations. So maybe something that resonates with their religion or their occupation, for instance. If they have a hobby, skiing, not so many skiers here. Fishing, though, will be impacted by climate change, and there are easy ways to connect to fishing, and lots of people around here love to fish. So this is a way that you can sort of bridge the gap to something they care about. You can talk about impacts to economics. Obviously, people are really concerned about the economy. You can talk about impacts to healthcare, not having to spend as much healthcare money on incidences of, for instance, asthma if we have a cleaner future. And if someone is very religious, you could talk to them about stewardship of the earth. The idea that God gave us the earth to look after and it's his creations to look after. That's something that resonates sometimes. The only thing you have to be careful with framing is that you don't zoom in so far. So if you're only talking about skiing, that can be problematic after a while because skiing isn't going to be the biggest. Loss of snow in Colorado isn't going to be our biggest problem. But it's a really good way to hook people, to get them to think about it as something that matters to them, not something that's happening far away to polar bears. The other thing that I always tell people is to start your conversation with a grain of truth. This means that when somebody says something to you that maybe you don't entirely agree with, you find a way to take a part of it and give it back to them as a grain of truth. So here's an example. If I say to somebody I want to talk to them about climate change for whatever reason, and they say, you know, I have so many different things I'm worried about right now, I just can't worry about climate change. That's frustrating to me because I personally think climate change is the thing they should be the most worried about. But I don't say that. Instead, I say, you know what? You are right. There are many things to worry about right now. What are some of the things that worry you the most? By doing that, I've made them feel heard. They feel like I listened to them. And I'm going to gain some information from that. I'm going to find out what things they are most concerned about, and I might be able to tie those things to climate change and reframe the conversation to encompass both. So, grains of truth. All right, the third was addressing their understanding, sometimes. So, for the concerned, ooh, there's a Harry Potter ringtone. For the concerned, the confused, or the curious, science can be really helpful. Giving them a brief, not too complicated version of the science can be really great. However, if somebody is dismissive on the very far end of the spectrum, extreme denial, the science won't help. It won't change their mind. Maybe you've seen this already. Giving them the science won't help. So you just skip it with them. But if you are talking about the science, skip the jargon, okay? Keep it simple. Try to directly address any misconceptions. If you figure out pretty quickly that they confuse hole in the ozone layer and climate change, get right in there and explain the difference. And try to use metaphors if you can. So I already told you my weather climate metaphor. I have another one that I like for that, which is if somebody says, I don't know about climate change, it's snowing right now, there can't be global warming. I say that's like taking a ruler and putting it on the ground and saying, look, the earth is flat. You're zoomed in too far. Zoom out. Okay, climate is about much more than whether it's snowing today. So metaphors can be really effective. And you may, in some instances, actually need to avoid buzzwords. There may be people you have a conversation with where you just can't say climate change or global warming. And that's okay. You can still have the conversation about renewable energy without ever mentioning those words. It can be really frustrating, but there are just groups of people for whom those words are going to shut them down entirely. Another thing you can say instead of greenhouse gases, which can be a buzzword, is heat-trapping gases, for instance. So avoiding the words that might trigger them to think about their ideology and not about what you're saying. All right, we're on to my last step, which is empowering them to act. So you have to emphasize actions that are effective, but you also have to emphasize actions that make them feel like they're doing something. So people are more likely to act and to feel concerned about something if they feel empowered, if they feel like they actually have the ability to make a difference. So you can explain personal actions that they can take. You can also warn them about single action bias, though. So remember, just because you recycled today doesn't mean you're off the hook. There are many other things that are important to do. And you can also harness the power of social norms. How many of you have been to a hotel where you saw a placard in the bathroom that said, please reuse your towel and help save the earth, or something like that? So studies show that if that placard says 75% of our guests reuse their towels, you are significantly more likely to reuse yours. That's the power of social norms. The same thing is true, for instance, if you're walking on a beach that's covered in trash, people are much more likely to just drop their trash too, whereas if it's a pristine beach, they won't, because the social norm is not there to leave your trash. So using the power of social norm means things like reminding them that they can take social and political action and that others are, and encouraging them to talk to others. Because changing your light bulbs by yourself, if you just change all the light bulbs in your house, you are not solving global warming. I'm sorry. I wish you were, but you're not. However, if you change all the light bulbs in your house and then you tell all of your friends that you changed the light bulbs in your house and why, and they tell all of their friends that they changed the light bulbs in their house and why, you see where we're going here, right? that has much more power than just what you did in your house. So encourage them to talk to others. My final pointers for you: don't pressure yourself to get it all right. You don't have to win every conversation. You probably know more about the science than they do anyway, and that's okay to get it wrong sometimes. You have to have the conversation and you have to start, so you don't have to win. Know when to exit gracefully. Remember what I said about screaming at one another? If that's happening, or if you're even just starting to get mad, it's time to go. Make it stop, especially if there are other people around. Other people are going to watch there being this big debate between two people. It emphasizes the idea that there are two sides and then it's contentious. Just take it down, leave, come back another time. And, well, there we go. Don't forget about your grains of truth. Don't forget to take things that they say and give them back to them in a positive way in order to help them feel like they've been heard. Climate change cannot be a taboo subject. If climate change is taboo, if we're not talking about it, if that map stays blue, we aren't going to do enough as a country, as a community, to deal with it. We have to talk about it. And talking about climate change is one of the most effective actions that you can take. So talk. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Doctor. If we could transition to the question slide, and one of the things I really got out of your presentation was it's really about planting seeds, it sounds like, and being consistent in your action, consistent in your example, and being that sort of that role model for other people in things that we do and take for granted perhaps in our daily lives. So the first question we have here, Doctor, is how can we remain hopeful when the president withdraws from the Paris Agreement and climate change?
I think that's calls climate
calls
change.
Climate change a hoax.
Yeah, that's a tough one. So there's a couple of different ways I could approach this question. I could talk about the Paris Agreement, for instance, but I think what I believe that the best way that I find hope every day is actually with the young people, with my students, and with all of you. The fact that things like this are happening right now, and that everyone is here right now, and that all of you are going to be empowered to do something and to talk about climate change, which is obviously my talking point, but that gives me hope. And the fact that we graduate at Eckerd College, we graduate the most students from the environmental studies major. My classes on environmental communication and climate change communication they overfill. I have wait lists. So I get all of my hope from the young people who are trying to push forward these things because they realize that their future depends on it.
Excellent. And then another question, Doctor, it says, what's an easy response to deniers that say the Earth's climate has always gone in cycles?
Okay, so if you are going with the data route, you can talk about how the Earth's climate has, in fact, always gone through cycles. The issue here isn't that we are going through one of our normal cycles, it's that we've actually exceeded our normal cycle by hundreds of parts per million of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. That's sort of the jargon version. The less jargon version is that although climate cycles are normal, this is an abnormal that is a doubling of the cycle that we've seen previously. So if you have to get into the science with them, that's sometimes what you have to do. But the cycles that have gone on, one of the things you can do is affirm for them, you're right, there have been cycles. The problem isn't that we're in a normal cycle, it's that we've exceeded the normal cycles.
It's a great question in the middle of the bottom. So what's the best age to teach children about climate change? Do you have any thoughts on that in terms of academic and other reading material?
So I think we need to be starting earlier than we are. And I know that that can be really hard to do for a couple of reasons. First of all, it just seems terrifying to teach little kids about how their future, their future might look like if we don't act on this. But there are lots of ways we can talk about what's happening with the climate without getting too apocalyptic with them. The other major challenge, though, is that for many educators, the political pressure, especially if they work at a public school, the political pressure from perhaps parents to not talk about climate change can be overwhelming. So at no point do I want to pressure teachers to get themselves into trouble, but I think that honestly we should be starting in elementary school. There are aspects of the carbon cycle, for instance, that are pretty easy for kids to understand, that we could begin there.
Right. So how can we get the media to cover climate change without giving equal time to deniers?
That's a good question. One of my favorite things to show my students is has anyone seen the Jon Stewart, is it the John? No, it's John Oliver's, the 97 Scientists versus Bill Nye. The 97 Scientists with Bill Nye versus the 3 climate deniers. Generally, when it's covered in the media, it's got one climate denier and Bill Nye, who I love him, but he's actually not a scientist. So that's a little rough. Getting them to move past the balances bias is a really tough call because it has to do with these entrenched journalistic norms. So I think one thing we can do, instead of trying to get the mainstream media to stop showing 1 versus 1, is we can start drawing attention to all of the public and social events that are beginning to happen around climate change. So continuing to have, for instance, larger protests that get covered by the media, trying to sort of take over the media in other aspects so that when you come in with that one scientist versus that one climate denier, that one climate denier looks kind of silly.
And I think the numbers are really changing. In your graphics, you've really shown how we're changing and evolving, and young people becoming more familiar with what's going on in the environment, more concerned about it. I think it's a great trend we're seeing. And one of the last questions here, and I know you're not this kind of doctor, but it says, how do we keep from being depressed about this issue?
Yeah. That's a tough one. I actually do, in my climate change communication class, we spend the whole week on how to be okay with the depression that we do have and push past it. Because by the end of the semester, it's rough. Like, we're feeling a little beat up. And again, like I said, one of the things that I find the most hope in is our young people. I think that they have an incredible capacity to deal with this, and they want to so badly. I think the other thing is that we don't really have a choice. We have to have hope. Otherwise, there's nowhere else to go. So my daily feeling, I wake up every day worrying about climate change, but my daily feeling is if I'm not going to be hopeful about this, I can't help other people be hopeful about this, and we aren't going to go anywhere. We don't have a choice. You've got to have hope.
And I'll ask the last question, not on the screen, but what would you say to a young college student who's struggling with, they're a person of faith, they've been raised in the church, and yet they're in the world of academia and science and school, they're struggling with, wow, what should I do? How do I handle this from a faith perspective, but also know what the reality of science is telling them?
Yeah, so again, I often move towards the stewardship of the earth principles for that, but also I would direct them to the work of Katharine Hayhoe, because again, she's an evangelical, and you can see many of her talks online. She presents videos about exactly how to reconcile the ideas of God and faith with the ideas of science, and she's really good at it, much better at it than I am. So I would recommend them straight to her and to her work. And also, if you've ever seen Years of Living Dangerously, it's a video series. I think it's on Netflix. Yeah, and she actually features in one of them and talks about her work on how to reconcile faith and science, and she does it really well.
Let me see, is there any more questions? So Bill Nye, the science guy, is a mechanical engineer who has taught millions of people about, he's not a scientist, we heard that. And let's see, we also saw, can you suggest a sequence of appropriate topics discussed with K-12 students? You might have covered that a little bit, but could you add on to that a bit?
Yeah, I think it would be important to start early with the carbon cycle, actually. And that seems like it's a really, it can be a very complex topic, but you can talk about it in relatively simple ways. So talking about how much of our carbon is stored in the earth and how much is in the atmosphere, and how we're basically taking really, 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 really old carbon that's been stored for so long underground and then putting it back into the atmosphere where it didn't belong. And that is something that kids even seem to be able to really grasp. So most of us here probably know that fossil fuels don't come from dinosaur bones, but in a 6-year-old's mind, they might. And one of my colleagues' son asked the other day, he was learning about fossil fuels, and he said, so is my plastic dinosaur made of real dinosaurs? It's like, wow, you know, that's actually a pretty sophisticated understanding of what's going on. So it's something that actually can be, I would start with the carbon cycle and sort of move from there into ways in which we're altering the carbon cycle.
Joanna, thank you so much for being here today.
Of
Let's give
course,
her a round
thank
of
you.
applause. Oh, such an exciting presentation.